think we can start. Welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Julie Guthman tonight. Before I actually say something about Julie, I just have a few housekeeping communication. So fire regulation imposed me to tell you that if you hear the fire alarm, please go to the next exit and join the car park where our event organizer, Carl Smith, will take care of you. And please ensure that your mobile phones are switched off for the talk. Okay, we're going to have a presentation by Professor Julie Guthman for about 55 minutes. Then we will have time for questions and answers, and we need to leave this place by 7:30. Okay, this is for the housekeeping. Now, the important bit. Okay, it's a great pleasure to have Julie here. Julie is professor at University of California, professor of social sciences at University of California, Santa Cruz. Today, she's going to talk about Fat Places Exploring Environmental Causes of Obesity, which is based on her latest book, just published, recently published. The book is Weighing in Obesity, Food Justice and the Limits of Capitalism, published by University of California Press. I highly recommend to read it. It's a great read. This book has already received 2 awards. The first one by the Association of the Study of Food and Society, and the second one by James Blunt Innovative Publication Award from Cultural and Political Ecology Specialty Group of the Association of the American Geographers. Julie Guthman is a great scholar, a food scholar, human geographer, very well known in this field. I hope you will enjoy her presentation, and I just give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mara, for that introduction. Thank you all so much for coming. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to share some of my new work. This is the cover of my book. The asparagus is a bait and switch. It's nothing about asparagus. And so what I'm talking about today is some of what's in the book, as well as some articles that are forthcoming in the Annals, forthcoming in Environment and Planning A and Progress in Human Geography, for those of you who are geographers. So today what I want to do, or this evening I should say, I want to focus on certain environmental explanations of obesity, which have become quite popular among public health practitioners, geographers, planners, food activists, and not least the First Lady of the United States. And let me just say, I'm so thankful she's still the First Lady. So I won't tease her too much. So specifically, I want to discuss what's been canonized in the literature as the Obesogenic Environment thesis. This is the idea that people have become fatter because they are surrounded by, because they live in environments where fast, junky food is ubiquitous and the opportunities for physical activity are limited. So this is one of the earlier definitions of the obesogenic environment. Now this has close ties with the food desert thesis, which I'm sure you've heard about. The food desert thesis says that people are fat because they don't have food available, or they don't have the right food available. So there's a difference in emphases. The obesogenic environment thesis emphasizes ubiquity of food, and the other one emphasizes dearth, but they're really 2 sides of the same coin. The idea is there's not enough access to the right kind of food, which often gets coded as fresh fruits and vegetables and lean meats, etc. Now, this thesis is nearly hegemonic among public policy people, planners, advocates, and one reason is it's popular is it appears to shift blame away from individuals, because let's face it, there's a lot of nasty things that are said about fat people these days. These are from ads that were published in the state of Georgia that were really meant to kind of shame parents and their children about fatness, and it was a very controversial ad campaign. So this thesis really tries to take that shift away from individuals and instead implicate the food industry and to some extent regional planning practices, to the extent that it focuses on the built environment. And another reason I believe it is popular is that it leads to relatively palatable, politically palatable and doable solutions. These include creating more outlets for fresh fruits and vegetables in inner city food deserts, redesigning or remarketing public spaces to encourage walking and bicycling, or educational campaigns to achieve obesity reduction. This is a farmer's market in a Northern California city in a very upscale community, as it looks. And it's sunny. Sorry. Okay. Now, it's already hot in here. I'm all for implicating powerful actors, but it's not at all clear that this thesis holds up to scrutiny. The problem is in part methodological. Studies are limited by the availability and commensurability of useful data to test the thesis and tend to rely on questionable proxies. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But it's also conceptual, owing in part to the inability of quantitative research to answer questions of causality. These studies embed several untested assumptions about the character of the problem. So today I want to focus on two assumptions that are embedded in this thesis. The first is that the built form, the built environment, determines people's eating and exercise behaviors. And the second is that people's eating and exercise behaviors determine obesity. That latter one is obviously the more challenging one, so when I get there, you might think I'm a bit nuts. So taken together, these critiques suggest a problem of problem closure. And here I'm referring to the ideas of Martin Hager when he writes about when a specific definition of a problem is used to frame subsequent study of the problem, study of the problem's causes and consequences in ways that preclude alternative explanations or conceptualizations of the problem. So problem closure can also entail defining the causes of the problem in relationship to socially acceptable solutions, such as farmers markets and bike paths. What I want to suggest is that these sorts of solutions, like making more farmers markets, are clearly more politically palatable and doable than those that may be raised by alternative conceptualizations of the problem that might, for example, address significant income inequality, class-related stresses, or the pervasiveness of toxins, all of which there is evidence for have a role in obesity. For that matter, defining obesity as a problem that must be redressed or must be prevented or stopped is in itself an example of problem closure, because we're not considering in what ways obesity may or may not be pathological. I'm not going to get to that today specifically in my talk, but I'm happy to entertain questions about that at the end. So before I go any further, I just want to put one major caveat on all what I'm going to say is that many of my working assumptions and examples and arguments draw on the United States context, and they do not necessarily hold in the UK. But to the extent that they don't, it's not just a matter of, well, that she must be wrong. I mean, I think the differences matter. The differences matter in terms of the nature of built environments, in terms of the class and race dynamics, in terms of the regulatory environment, et cetera. So I think we should pay attention to what doesn't hold as a way to kind of think more deeply about, well, what are these things that actually might matter. So I'm going to start by focusing on some of the scholarship on the obesogenic environment thesis. And this thesis has given rise to a lot of scholarship. And it's particularly popular with geographers, and particularly popular with those who do spatial analysis. Because you can model, so in terms of geographers, it's popular among those who do geographic information science. So what a lot of the studies attempt to model things like proximity to grocery stores, urban density, drive to work times, jack-in-the-boxes per square mile. So those are the type of things that get modeled in these theses. Nevertheless, for the most part, the studies relating different foodscapes to obesity have yielded marginal, inconclusive, or even contradictory results. Studies that have looked at the physical activity side have findings that are somewhat more robust, especially that those here again in the United States, that relates sprawl and weight status. Although, as I will suggest, this may be a spurious correlation. So that's not supposed to be there. Okay, so up in the upper left-hand corner, you see like the kind of suburb that is imagined to be obesogenic, because you can't really walk anywhere. You have to drive to get it to go to school, to go to work, to go to the supermarket. Now, the marginality of these findings can in part be explained methodologically, and here I'll mention 3 issues. So the first, one of the most surprising features of this area of research is that many studies do not actually measure obesity in place or space, but they extrapolate the relationship from other associations. So I'm just going to give one example for each of my points, and there's many more. So there was one study that claimed to look at the relationship between convenient access to fast food and the prevalence of obesity among Black and low-income populations, and it focused on Orleans Parish in Louisiana. So the study found that fast food restaurants were associated with predominantly Black and low-income neighborhoods, with race having stronger associations than income. Yet the study didn't actually measure whether obesity clustered in space. It only asserted that convenient access to fast food explains the prevalence of obesity among Black and low-income populations. That's one point. Second point, so one great limitation of these studies is that the absence of appropriate data to test possible hypotheses about the environment. It appears that data availability has driven much of the research, and sometimes the data available is quite coarse. So the kind of data you see, at least in the United States, and it depends on what kind of censuses are available, tend to look at the kind of stores available in a particular area. One study looked at how many what was available at highway stops among interstate highways, which was a really odd study. So the one particular example I want to give here was a study in Erie County, New York, and it found a statistically positive relationship between women's body mass index, which is the standard way of measuring obesity that we can talk about in the Q&A if you'd like. So it found a positive relationship between women's BMI and diverse land use, especially when restaurants dominated non-residential land use. So basically this study was claiming that if there's a lot of stuff going on in an area, there was a more likelihood of having a higher BMI. And the study was trying to make a claim that having more restaurants created a higher BMI. Well, think about the West End of London, which I had the pleasure of visiting a couple days ago. Really, it was such a pleasure. And that's a very diverse land use, and yet you wouldn't consider that an obesogenic environment. And in this study, it didn't actually identify the type of restaurant that predicted higher BMIs. We didn't know if it was high-end, shishi places, tapas bars, let's say, or national chains like Denny's, which is what we want to United States less desirable restaurants. And sometimes the data is so coarse that the findings veer on the ridiculous. There's one off-cited study that found a relationship between fast food restaurants per square mile and rates of obesity. It was done on a statewide level, so Kansas, California. I mean, these are kind of absurd studies. And then perhaps the greatest limitation is that these studies are designed to test correlations. Thus, in cases where associations are more robust, it is unclear what's driving what. For instance, some studies have found significant associations between the likelihood of being obese in neighborhoods with a high density of fast food restaurants, again you hear that one, in comparison with those with low density. And so they actually do measures of how many fast food restaurants there are in a particular place. Likewise, several studies have shown modest to significant relationships between sprawl, measured by lower density of, or lower development in areas, and or they'll use vehicle miles traveled for work in relationship to obesity. However, to my mind, it seems quite a leap to suggest that these features make people bigger. For there are really a lot of other possible explanations. Restaurants, for example, may locate where they will have likely buyers, or people who are already big and have low socioeconomic status, which they almost necessarily do if you're big, may locate in areas with high fast food density because guess what? The real estate in those areas is cheaper. So there's lots of critiques of these models, and I could go on and on and on. And there's even among those who are kind of more committed to these models, there's a concession that they've not revealed all that much. Some critique the research design. They say they're not sophisticated enough. In terms of the multivariate modeling, I can't really speak to that because I'm not a multivariate modeler. Others talk about that these kind of models demonstrate the limits of quantitative research, that you really need to talk to people to find out what's going on. And it is quite true that the thesis treats people as objects of their environment, as if there's nothing mediating the environment and their mouths. In fact, I find this actually quite striking, that the kind of impulse for this thesis is to de-responsibilize individuals, and yet the thesis actually imagines people to be quite unreflexive in terms of what they do in their built environment, what stores they go into, what food they tend to buy. And that's why when people talk about obesogenic environments, you actually see headless bodies or bodies from behind, because there's just kind of no subjectivity given to obese people, and yet those who are thin are seen as quite reflective in their eating choices. And this is really the implication for this thesis, right? Because if indeed we are surrounded by fast, junky food, that those who somehow remain thin in these environments must have some kind of higher capabilities of resisting these environments. And so there is these, subtle and not so subtle ways in which class and class cultures are implicated in the thesis. Now, what few studies countenance is that it may be the personal characteristics and behaviors of people that happen to cluster in space that are the basis of the correlations between obesity and space or place. So the neglect of this possibility suggests that the obesogenic environment thesis has not been informed by the context or composition debate that has taken place in the literature in health geography. The heart of this debate is whether it is the attributes of places or the characteristics of people who happen to inhabit particular places that best predict health outcomes. So given the close association between weight status and socioeconomic status, this potential rebuke of the thesis deserves consideration. Again, because people who are fat tend to be condemned to low socioeconomic status, they are more likely to locate in places where real estate is cheaper. So again, this is to suggest that there's other reasons why there might be these strong correlations rather than this assumption that the environment is making people fat. Relatedly, the thesis ignores what makes environments obesogenic in the first place, and that too has to do with class and race. Which is to say that to the extent that some places have many features that are supposedly obesogenic, often reflects the financial resources of those who inhabit such spaces and the waves of investment or disinvestment that have produced such environments. So in the United States, at least, low-income communities or low-middle-class, working-class communities are often those in these outer suburbs with lots of strip malls and fast food, et cetera. And likewise, the food deserts are because there's been severe disinvestment. So people are locating there because because they don't have the means to live elsewhere. And this point can be argued from the obverse. The gentrified urban cores that contain upscale and thus presumably healthier eating venues, as well as ample public space amenable to walking, both attract businesses to meet the food tastes of residents and generate the taxes to improve and maintain those enjoyable places. What I'm saying here is that thin real estate is expensive. This is a slide of an upscale neighborhood in San Francisco. Finally, the thesis fundamentally relies on the energy balance model of obesogenesis. And here's where I get really provocative. Now, what's really behind this thesis is the idea that features of the built environment matter because they are imagined to mediate caloric input and output. But the idea that people are getting fatter over time, or that people of different socioeconomic statuses are fatter than others, assumes a calories in, calories out model of obesogeneity that's come under quite a bit of scrutiny. So here again, I'm going to say it's probably not all about the calories, and there's lots of ways it's not all about the calories. And since I've written this book, I've gotten kind of obsessed with thinking about calories, and I'm not going to talk about this much today, but I'll give you an example. Is this box of juice has no calories in it because there's no molecules of calories in a box of juice. Calories are a construct that only become made through something called the burning of them. And so when they first discovered what a calorie was, or when they first decided what a calorie was, they would burn food to see how much heat it would emit. So there might be vitamin C in here, maybe. We can look at the label. There's certainly carbohydrates. There's other things that have molecules, but there are no calories. So the calorie itself is deeply problematic. I'm not going to talk about that in too much today, although I don't have much more to say about that other than my fascination. But I do want to talk about other ways in which other research that kind of disrupts the energy balance model. So the problem is that the energy balance model actually doesn't do a very good job of explaining the significant and abrupt rise in size since 1980. This is US data, obviously. And it doesn't do a very good job of explaining variation in size among different populations. Now, again, when we talk about the rise in obesity, we're generally talking about the use of the body mass index as a way to measure it. The body mass index has all sorts of problems. It's a ratio of weight to height. So people with bigger bone mass or more muscle tissue can have higher BMIs. So there's lots to be said about the BMI itself. That's not my topic for today. But to give you a sense, since most of the change in obesity rates have been since 1980, in 1980 the average BMI for men and women was around 25. By 2002, it's around 28. Well, that's just an index. It has no inherent meaning. But to give you a sense of what that means, it's equivalent to about a 20-pound change for a woman who's 5'5" tall. And since the early 2000s, it's actually, the BMIs have actually leveled off for most population groups. Now, that is an abrupt change that we need to think about what could cause that. And genetics, traditionally understood, cannot explain that kind of abrupt change, because we think of genetics as something that happens over evolutionary time. And while there can be genetic mutations, it's found that only about 5% of cases of extreme obesity seem to be related to a genetic mutation. So because genetics can't explain this very well, people assume it has to do with changes in eating and physical activity. That's the energy balance model. And the variation among different groups is assumed to be about different habits. So basically the idea is that people with low socioeconomic status who tend to be bigger are assumed to be so because they eat more cheap food and supersize their meals. But there's some challenges to this model, and there's some real puzzles that the model doesn't very well explain. Empirically, the presumption that since 1980 people have increased the number of calories they take in relative to those they expend has simply not been demonstrated. The best book on this is by Michael Gard and Jan Wright. They're Australians. They wrote a book called The Obesity Epidemic, and they went through hundreds of studies on energy intake and output, or physical activity and eating, and they found no definitive proof that food intake in industrialized countries has risen and activity levels have declined, particularly in the years since 1980. Now, a lot of these studies are based on self-reporting, which people tend to always exaggerate the good things and underplay the bad things, but all groups would do that, so that, so people would tend to understate how much they eat and overstate how much they exercise. But that, if everybody does that, how can you kind of make a claim about why different groups are bigger than others? And they actually found that some of the literature suggests that there's been a reduction in food intake in the past several decades. We really don't know, and that's my point. I'm not saying definitively that people don't eat more. I'm just saying we actually don't know if people eat more. Now, there is this one study, that's the name of the study, What We Eat in America. It was put out by the United States Department of Agriculture, and it was based on national health surveys taken in 2007 and 2008. And it showed marked similarity among racial groups in daily caloric intake, 2,198 calories for whites, 2,095 for African Americans, and 2,109 for Mexican Americans. And that's the only groups they counted, and those are coarse groups, but that's what they did. And same caloric intake, and yet study after study has demonstrated that African American women in particular are much bigger than whites, and that white women show the greatest variation in rates of obesity. The study also did not show that caloric intake differs by income. Those earning less than $25,000 per year reported consuming 2,104 calories per day, while those earning more than $75,000 per year reported consuming slightly more, 2,238 calories per day. Now, this is just one study, and it's based on the self-reporting of national health surveys, but still, we have to think about why could that be. Another kind of puzzle that's not explained well is this kind of upward skew. Since there's been a significant rise in very big people since 1980, you can kind of see that on the slide. And there's parallel evidence that suggests that very big kids are getting bigger while other increases in size among children are flattening. And when you have that kind of upward skew, what that means is that these extremes are kind of driving the mean up. And so on a population level, the average weight gain may be more like 15 to 20 pounds since 1980, which may not be as frightening as all the kind of videos you see of fat people walking would suggest. People have gotten a lot taller in the last, 50 years, 100 years, and there's much less ado about that. And then there's this, which is the rise in infant obesity. And so there was one major study of a health maintenance organization in Massachusetts, and it found that there had been a 73% increase in obesity among 0 to 6 month olds. Okay? 0 to 6 month olds. This is a population that generally doesn't work out at the gym or eat Cheetos. So it suggests that something else is going on. So what might explain this? And how am I on time? Okay. Well, there's emerging evidence, this is somebody I interviewed for my book a few years ago. He's an endocrinologist at the University of California, Irvine. There's emerging evidence that a number of exogenous substances may be playing a role in the rise in size, and he's pictured here because he's one of the people who's been writing about it. And he's coined the term obesogens to refer to environmental toxins and particularly endocrine-disrupting chemicals that are somehow altering biological pathways in the body in ways that may lead to obesity. Now, the idea that environmental toxins may be causing obesity was first theorized by a British woman, actually. Her name is Paula Bailey Hamilton, and she published her findings in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. That's the only place she really published them, and so she was seen as kind of a quack. So in this article, which I found by Googling, it was because I was just fascinated about what possible connections could exist between environmental toxins and obesity. In this article, she pointed the finger at the proliferation of synthetic, organic, and inorganic chemicals since 1940 in the form of pesticides, dyes, perfumes, cosmetics, food additives, plastics, fire retardants, solvents, surfactants, and so forth, a long list. And in making her case, she cited a number of studies that had shown that exposure to pesticides in lab animals had produced significant weight gain, with even when the experimental groups had less food intake than the control groups. And she notes that these results have been ignored, explained away, or even missed because that's not what folks were looking at. She also included this graph in her article. So the curve with the little circles on is supposed to represent the proliferation of chemicals in the environment, and the line with the triangles is supposed to represent the increase in obesity since 1980. Now, there's a lot of things that have changed since 1980, and just about everything's increased since 1980. I mean, in the United States, there's much more corn production, which is often attributed to the obesity epidemic. But there's also a lot more video game watching. There's a lot more hybrid cars made. College admissions have gotten a lot tougher. And there's coffee shops on just about every corner. So much has changed since 1980, so this really could be a spurious correlation. And the fact that she was publishing her own kind of self-help detox diet didn't help her credibility. Nevertheless, since then, people have been saying that she's really onto something, and now she's cited in this emerging literature on environmental obesogens. So what's some of the evidence here? Well, there's a growing number of animal studies that are showing that exposures to various endocrine-disrupting chemicals are affecting body size. And the most extensive research in the United States has been done by this woman, Retha Newbold, who works at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. I also had the opportunity to interview her a few years ago. She was working with dethylstilbestrol, or DES, for development issues, and notice all animals were much bigger. Now, does everybody know what DES is? It's actually really significant. So this is a synthetic estrogen that was given to women in the United States in the 50s and 60s to prevent miscarriage and to promote lactation. And the children of DES women had unusual rates of infertility when they became adults, and all sorts of reproductive cancers. So the women themselves were barely affected by taking DES basically as medicine, but their children, their progeny, had severe effects that didn't become manifest until adulthood, and that's really significant to this story. So anyways, Retha Newbold was working with DES on her lab animals to look for other development issues to try to understand more about what synthetic estrogens might be doing bodily. And she noticed, and she wasn't looking for it, that all her animals were getting bigger. She had to actually change the size of the cages she was using. And since then, she's been doing experiments on DES and a whole bunch of other substances on lab animals, and she's controlled for diet and exercise in all of her animal studies with the only variable being the dose of synthetic estrogens. And the results have been, as she put it, consistent, conclusive, and convincing. So, for example, these mice were exposed to synthetic estrogen while in gestation. They were not particularly affected at birth, but as you see, were 20 to 30% bigger at adulthood. And you can see, you know, as the label says, the one exposed to dithylstilbestrol is the bigger one. Now, there's been similar findings with bisphenol A or BPA, which is found in plastics. It also is found in, it not only is found in baby bottles and water bottles, but it lines soup cans. And again, I don't know if this is true here. A recent study by the Center of Disease Control in the United States found that of 400 people, 95% had detectable levels of BPA in their urine. There's also been, not only animal studies, there's also been in vitro studies, lab dishes. And these studies have shown that some of these chemicals can induce stem cells that have no particular destination to become fat cells, or that stem cells will produce more fat cells, again, in gestation. And now that this thesis is getting some attention, there's been some epidemiological studies, although it's very hard to control for this epidemiologically. But for example, there's one study that found that kids, this was in North Carolina, found that kids exposed to higher levels of PCBs and DDE, which was a kind of related to DDT, those exposed before birth were fatter than those exposed to lower levels. So much of this, these pathways are now understood to be what's called epigenetic. Epi for on top of the gene. And since doing the book, I've been becoming really fascinated with environmental epigenetics. I have an article with my colleague Becky Mansfield coming out in Progress in Human Geography, talking about the implications of environmental epigenetics for geography, because I think it actually challenges spatial analysis in lots of different ways because of the temporality of epigenetics. Anyways, epigenetics refers to a range of mechanisms that redirect phenotypical development without altering the underlying DNA sequence. And generally it does that by intervening with gene expression. So the most well-known and understood epigenetic process is called methylation. Methylation occurs when combinations of carbon and hydrogen atoms attach themselves along the DNA. This deactivates specific genes, therefore affecting the development of the organism. So the key mechanism is actually turning off genetic expression. Now, what's really interesting about methylation is it's heritable when the cell, I didn't make the slide up, by the way, I got it off the web because I'm incapable of doing this slide. Methylation is heritable when the cell divides. So the methylation pattern persists throughout the organism's lifetime and possibly beyond. In other words, these changes to the DNA from environmental chemicals are heritable. So in humans, there's this highly cited epidemiological study involving tracking the descendants of victims of the Nazi-imposed Dutch famine. And many of the descendants, several generations later, have higher BMIs and are more prone to diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. So it is now believed that those exposed to famine in their early embryonic stages had lower methylation of a gene that is a key factor in growth and development. And this methylation pattern, again, has persisted. So several generations later, they're still showing this particular gene being methylated. So in this vein, some in the field of epigenetics have theorized that long-term exposures to stress and past nutritional deprivation could also help explain the relationship between low socioeconomic status and obesity prevalence that many assume is the consequences of the current day dietary patterns of the relatively poor. So, to put that in other terms, that past nutritional problems, past insufficiencies can be carried on epigenetically and affect body size. So this is this whole new way of thinking about the differences in body sizes among different kind of groups. But the critical point here is that the exposures often occur in utero. Pregnant women who are exposed pass this methylation pattern onto their fetus in ways that alter their developmental pathways of the fetus. That means there are no calories involved, or at least at the beginning. Now, it may be true that once you pass on these particular patterns, that eating, of course it would be true, that eating, practices would intersect, would interrelate with the kind of epigenetic design that's passed on. Now, also critical is the lag time between dose and response, and this is why the DES example is so important. Again, the children of DES moms didn't have these symptoms or conditions or diseases manifest until adulthood. So this could help suggest why there's this could be this big lag time between the proliferation of these chemicals in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and the kind of surge in obesity starting in the 1980s. Now, there's a whole lot of other science that I've come across that really challenges the ways we think about obesity. One that I just want to point out is the role of fat tissue. So there's research has found that fat tissue is a regulator, and it's part of the human endocrine system. It's not just passive. There's several hormones that are secreted by fat tissue. Some help suppress appetite and protect against insulin resistance. But fat tissue can also produce more fat tissue. And fat can be a response to inflammation and create more fat. And so now there's research that suggests that inflammation that comes from exposure to air pollution may be implicated in obesity. Nevertheless, the important point is there's acknowledgement that fat production can be an adaptive response and not necessarily pathological. For instance, just in the, we always hear about the idea that fatness causes obesity. Fatness causes, that didn't come right. Fatness causes diabetes, but there's arguments that that the fatness is actually helping to deal with diabetes because you're sequestering the glucose in fat tissue rather than the blood supply. And also fat tissue can store toxins as well and keep them out of the blood. So there's an article that came out recently on the obesity paradox, and it found that several studies have shown that diabetes patients of normal weight are twice as likely to die than those who are overweight or obese. And there's been study after study that has shown that overweight and moderately obese patients with certain chronic diseases often live longer and fare better than so-called normal weight patients with the same ailments. So all this can help explain some of these puzzles. Again, since already existing fat cells are not only hard to get rid of, but can produce more fat cells, this may explain some of the gains, the increased prevalence of very, very large people, and that can explain why there's been this rise in the extreme obese. The lag time of exposure and manifestation, again, this suggests that why there is this time lag between the proliferation of chemicals and the manifestation in obesity in the 1980s. And it certainly can help explain why there's more infant obesity. Here's a baby chewing on what could well be a plastic made with bisphenol A. So, lots of implications here. There's many different chemicals that have been tested right now, and there's not all seem to cause obesity through the same biological pathways. The most definitive studies have been done on bisphenol A, on PFOA, which is a grease-proofing agent found on the lining of pizza boxes, on tribulatin, which is used as a paint preserver on seafood-bearing boats. There's also suggestion that phytoestrogens or more natural estrogens may be implicated too. So some of Retha Newbold's experiments have been done with genistein, which is derived from soy, and then we could think about all the soy that goes into baby formula and in food processing. There's evidence for several different agricultural chemicals, most of which have been associated with developmental disorders, but now are suspected of contributing to obesity too. And then the one I most want to point out, and there's very little evidence on it, and I think there's a reason, is the hormones that are used in beef in the United States. So, the United States, DES used to be given to beef cattle all the time to help fatten them up. DES was outlawed for the use in beef cattle, cattle, but there's now 6 different other synthetic hormones that are given to beef cattle, and they're all pretty much analogs of DES. Now, why is there a lot of research here? I mean, I'm being dyslexic today. Why is there so little research here? I think it's because the cattle industry in the United States has tremendous political power, and I suspect that there's been some suppression of research, but it's something that I actually would like to learn more about. So what is obviously of significance here is that many of these substances are used in the making and storing of the food supply. So these findings surely complicate issues of good food and the prevailing concerns with nutrients and calories, and of course fresh fruits and vegetables. So the research brings into much clearer focus how food is made. And this research thus really challenges current approaches to changing the food system in the United States, at least, where there's been a significant neglect of regulatory reform, and nearly all social movement activity has focused on developing positive alternatives and educating people about how great there are. So seriously, the food movement in the United States today is all about getting fresh fruits and vegetables to people who don't have them in areas, and it's all about building farmers markets and community-supported agriculture, and there's so little focus on the policy arena. It's a sad, sad thing. And these chemicals are used because there's been extreme regulatory failure. Very few chemicals, agricultural chemicals, have been banned from use since the Environmental Protection Agency was formed in 1970. We're talking about maybe how many, you can count them on one hand. And I have much to say about, a lot of the book is about my critiques of the alternative food movement, my friendly critiques, because I think, people have the right intentions. But because there's been so much focus on alternatives, what has essentially transpired is you have one food system where people who can afford it get this really great food, and then and that the good food is more costly by design. I have 5 minutes. Oh, that's perfect. Okay. It's more costly by design, like organics are costly by design to reward producers who do the right thing. And so the rest of this stuff is horribly underregulated, necessarily costs more, and so everybody else gets the dregs. So it's a real problematic way to change the food system. And of course, this is a direct challenge to the obesogenic environment thesis that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, because it suggests that we may indeed have an obesogenic environment, but it does not owe to the built form. And yet, again, this is where all the action is. As I suggested at the beginning, a lot of activity has been directed to changing the supply of food in the built farm. More farmers markets, produce delivery projects, very little actually about bringing supermarkets to food deserts. And this attention to the built form also has race and class consequences. So a lot of these efforts are trying to make food deserts more like the upscale health. They're trying to make them more healthy, but they're actually replicating more upscale places, which is in effect a form of gentrification. And in certain communities, people are actually rejecting this kind of activity because they're worried about having the real estate priced out from under them. So what I'm arguing is that we have seen quite a bit of problem closure around the so-called problem of obesity. And as, again, I've suggested that politically palatable and doable solutions have driven our problem conceptualization. Yet these relatively easy roads of educating people to the alternatives and setting up shop in low-income neighborhoods are understandably ineffective given this emerging knowledge about environmental toxins. Well, I'm sure I've provoked you quite a bit, so I think I will leave you with this food for thought. Here are some fresh fruits and vegetables that have some of the highest uses of pesticides in the United States. So let me just open it up for questions now.
Well, thank you very much, Julie.
Yes.
Incredibly interesting talk. And now we have time for questions. Okay, already somebody asking.
Yes.
Please, can you just introduce yourself briefly? Yep.
I'm Meta. I'm a master's student in sociology. And I wondered if you could say more about, on the one hand, you're saying that there are environmental toxins which are increasing the obesity rate, but you also kind of provided some evidence that obesity isn't necessarily bad for your health. So
Right, so how am I reconciling that? Yeah, you're not the first person that's asked that. Well, that's why I framed the book around this question of problem closure. I think we should be worried about environmental toxins. I think we should be worried about environmental toxins for all sorts of things. But I think the point of that is to show that we don't actually understand much about or as much as we think we do, about what causes obesity. And likewise, we don't understand as much as we think we do about what precisely is pathological about obesity and what's not. And so the overarching point is there's been this rush to judgment about obesity and this panic about obesity when there's so much more we need to understand. And also that our particular ways of addressing obesity have consequences. Not only stigmatizing fat people, which is problematic in its own terms, but like for instance trying to make fat places more like thin places in ways that can be gentrifying. So that's how I hold them together. I know it feels a little bit contradictory, but
Yes. More questions? Yes, please.
I agree entirely with your arguments about the toxins, but you are perhaps, in my view, overly dismissive of the role of the Pepsis, the Cokes, the McDonald's. Now, if I was reading your book, I would ask what your source of funding was, because I've read so many books by people who are funded by the food industry to produce arguments such as this.
yeah, I have absolutely no funding for this research. I mean, I had maybe a small grant of a few $1,000s from my university. But it's a good question. And, I'm not at all going to condone Pepsi or McDonald's And again, this relates to the question over here. I think one of the challenges of writing this book was to hold in tension a political economy critique, because I actually am opposed to the industrialization of food, and I don't like what big food does, but also really be sensitive to the cultural politics of naming obesity as a problem. And then there's this third piece of it, which is, of course, what kind of science is here that we don't understand. I'm not one to. There's no way I'm going to defend Pepsi or Coke or McDonald's. There's no question that they are probably causing obesity, but maybe not in the ways that they think we are, mainly through the calorie. It may be, indeed, the high fructose corn syrup is another one of these substances that is now thought to act quite differently in the body than cane sugar. So again, the point here is to look at other kind of biological pathways in this assumption about calories. And there's so much more that could be said about calories. So part of it is a critique of the kind of tyranny of calories as a way to think about what makes people big. So I'm sympathetic with you, and I'm not funded by big food, trust me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Simon Reed, University of Glamorgan.
Yeah.
I'm quite interested in this idea. We're challenging the idea of the calorie not being all that it seems to be, because if you look at energy restriction studies, for example, it doesn't matter whether it's through diet or through exercise or what kind of diet, the amount of weight loss that you get is very predictable based on calorie reduction.
Well, yeah, but now there's all these studies that are suggesting not so fast, because the study, when I gave a similar talk last week, somebody mentioned a study that I've heard of, and I have yet to have a chance to look it up, but that there a study where people were given 1,000 calories a day. Some were given mainly protein, some were given mainly carbohydrates, and some were given mainly fats. And which group lost the most weight? Those who take fats. Those who gain the most weight, or the people who had the fat and the protein lost weight. The people that had the carbohydrates gained weight. And so, and all the stuff we're learning about synthetic highly processed carbohydrates really, on its own terms, in nutritional science term, defies the calories model.
But if you look at those studies, the longest randomized controlled trials, as I understand, done with calorie restriction. It doesn't matter what diet you do. It doesn't matter whether it's high carb, low carb, high fat, low fat. In the longer term, once you go beyond about 12 months, the calorie restriction is the major predictor of weight gain or weight loss.
Maybe that's food restriction. I don't know. You ask people who've spent their whole lives dieting, and they might tell you a different answer. Every time I give a talk, I hear people actually battling it out in the audience about which study they read. But I think that there's much more to, again, on its own terms, forget about the environmental toxins, there's much more to the nutrition of dieting and weight gain than the public discussion is allowing.
Okay, Alison?
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing so much more nuanced perspectives, so many more nuanced perspectives to the conversation. It's obviously incredibly complicated, and it's wonderful that you've unpacked so many different issues. One of the things that you referenced in your talk, and you said you didn't have a chance to get to it, but you had something to add, was the BMI question. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that's problematic and how that sort of informs the discourse.
Sure. Well, okay, so I mentioned one, which is just that body mass index is a weight to height ratio with the height squared. And so anything that adds to weight, whether it's supposed to measure adiposity, fatness, and it doesn't. It measures something else. So that's one piece of it. But I think what's really interesting about it is that it's an index that has no meaning in and of itself. And so there's these various cutoff points for what's considered problematic. And so a BMI under 20 is considered underweight. From 20 to 25, I'm sure most of you know this, but from 20 to 25 is considered normal weight. From 25 to 30 is considered overweight, and above 30 is considered obese, above 40 is considered morbidly obese. So there's so many things that are interesting about that. I mean, those cutoffs were made in part based on clinical studies. There was at one point in the United States, they shifted the range, and so suddenly a bunch of people became obese overnight, just by a change of what's considered overweight. But it's really interesting if you think about it in terms of an average, because these are used on population levels. So you can have a bunch of people in let's say the 29, I mean, thousands and thousands of people with a 29 BMI, which would make them overweight. And if that group on average gains 5 to 7 pounds over a period of 10 or 20 years, as has happened, those people all are now obese. So they haven't gained that, as individuals, they haven't gained that much weight, but it looks like this huge increase in obesity. So it's really a matter of how these statistics are reported that can overstate the severity of the issue. Now, look, I live in the United States. There are places you go and there are a lot of very big people, and it's hard to deny that. But not everybody's big. I mean, I think there's so much more going on, and again, some of the places that there are bigger people, it's possible they've had more industrial and agricultural exposures. It's possible. Of course, it has to do with the food that people eat in different parts of the country, but it may not only be about calories. Anyway.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm a dietitian for Public Health Wales. I just wondered if there was any studies that, it was fascinating talk, but that actually show like a causal effect. So if you ate the same diet of the same food with the same calories, of foods that were high in sort of pesticides versus the same version of organic foods, is there studies that show that?
Not yet. Yeah, I mean this thesis of environmental obesogens is just several years old, and the researchers that are working on it have gotten quite a bit of pushback themselves. For a while they were having a hard time getting published, so I don't think it's that the research is nearly that sophisticated yet, but that would be really interesting. But I would still wonder, because there's so many intervening effects. So again, who is eating the organic fresh fruits and vegetables? People who already have kind of particular cultural capital, particular class status. So all these things became very difficult to separate. So it would be interesting to see if a clinical study like that, where you really isolate it, would matter. Because I think one of my critiques here is that these kind of studies are highly reductionist, and they're not really kind of thinking about the kind of really complex ways in which people's bodies have become different historically over time, and having to do with their daily practices and their exposures. But to answer your question, no, I haven't seen such a study.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
Martin Wheel, I'm a master's student here. A lot of your evidence comes from the 80s, but of course obesity and fatness didn't come in the 80s. In this country, I think in the 1700s, there was a man called Samuel Lambert, who I believe was 40 stone. And I remember from children's literature when I was young, fat people were always characterized as jolly. It was the jolly fat man in children's books.
Right.
Has there been any study of mental health and obesity? Because it seems to me that a lot of the people who are obese are often dislocated from society and may be suffering stress. And I wonder if in fact it's chemical stress, and it's stress that's the problem, not chemicals per se.
Well, there's a lot you just asked in there. Let me just clarify. I'm not saying that obesity began in the 1980s. There's been fat people throughout the history of the world, as far as we can tell from the fossil record and from the pictures of the Venuses. But there's no question that there's been, starting in 1980, kind of a more abrupt and significant and widespread change. Yeah, the stress is really important. Now, I don't know about studies of mental health and obesity per se, but I do know, and this is really interesting, that antidepressants. Read the label. If you take this drug, you will see weight gain. So here's this. Possibly you're depressed because you're fat and you're stigmatized, and you're taking a drug that will possibly make you fatter. So that's one route that's very interesting. And yes, chronic stress is another one of these things that goes, does not undercut the calorie model, but further complicates it, because now there's a lot of research that suggests that circulating cortisol, the stress hormone, is causing more obesity. So yeah, stress seems to be an important factor here. Yeah, thank you.
I'm Meredith Gaddison from the School of Psychology, and I'm a developmental psychologist. I was very surprised that you didn't mention some of the factors that developmental psychologists talk about quite a lot related to obesity now. Hypotheses about, for instance, sleep duration.
Mm-hmm.
Or, there was a paper published in Pediatrics just last month about screen time, where they showed that reducing screen time was the only effective intervention for reducing weight gain. I just wondered if you could say something about some of these variables that developmental psychologists discuss more.
Right.
Whether they're
Well,
relevant to your hypotheses.
just to be, I'm happy to speak a little bit to them, but just to be really clear, I came to this research as a geographer, really trying to think about this kind of environmental piece of it. So that's my starting point. And some of the research on other causes of just, I'm learning about as I go. But there is research that suggests that insomnia and obesity is related. There's research that suggests that the time of day of when you eat matters. And I had a conversation before the talk on circadian rhythms, and mine's really off right now. I haven't gotten used to the time at all. So I don't know. I'm not going to make a stupid joke about that I'll be fatter tomorrow. But so yeah, I mean, there's all this other stuff that seems to really affect fatness. Now, I'm not a developmental psychologist, and I haven't looked that much at that literature at all. So a lot of this I'm picking up along the way as I speak to people, and they say, yeah, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this. And so, again, the point is that there's much more, it's a much more complicated picture than the kind of popular understanding, and the interventions based on those popular understandings would have us believe. Yes, please.
Perhaps a follow-up. Given the complexity of the change that you've observed, whether it's pesticides or behavioural chemicals, whatever it is, why are we so adhered to the calorific argument and to the BMI when they are so, I'd argue, fundamentally flawed but ubiquitous concepts, even in this room, this debate tonight? And they're coming under increasing pressure, but they dominate the debate.
Yeah,
the other thing is, you haven't brought alcohol into this debate at all, because the lifestyle, you might have a gorgeously organic, fresh vegetables meal and take 2.5 bottles of wine with it, which will increase your weight. So
that would be me.
There's just so many variables and only two dominant kind of.
Yeah, well, I think in part the calories in, calories model is so exciting, or has not so exciting, is so hegemonic because it's simple. It's actually a research project I'd like to do, because I'm now collected about 15 different scholars that are thinking about the calorie in different ways, and this woman who can talk about it much better than I can is at UCLA, Hannah Landecker, and she's writing a book called American Metabolism, where she's looking at the history of calorie, the history of metabolism, what they mean. These are concepts that are constructions, But anyways, I think in part I'm saying this because while there's been this kind of increased attack on the calorie as a way to think about this, there's also this retrenchment. So Marianne Nessel, who's an American nutritionist who writes a lot of popular books, she just wrote a book, Why Calories Really Matter. And I know her from listening to her speak. She wants to give out a simple message. So I think part of it is the simplicity of the message rather than saying it's complicated. But I also think in terms of why there's all this focus on the farmers markets and this sort of thing. I mean, this was the challenge of writing my book. I have this sympathetic but critique of alternative food that's been like the mainstay of my research for the past 15 years. And then I kind of came into this work on obesity because I was shocked to the extent to which alternative food movements were invoking obesity as something they could solve. And so a lot of what I think is that people that have a lot of investment in their own personal practices and believe that their own successes are reflecting those practices, they kind of have a missionary position relative to fat people. If people could be like me, they will be thinner. And so I think a lot of what's driving this is this kind of real odd cultural politics of people who believe, they have a lot of faith in their own efforts and self-efficacy, wanting to teach others about that. And I know this from my students because I work with students who, because of the nature of the undergraduate undergraduate program I've been working in, they do all sorts of food politics, and they come to the major really I say, what do you want to do to change the food system? Because that's what they're supposed to be thinking about. They say, well, I want to teach people how to eat. You want to teach people how to eat? Is there other ways to think about changing the food system? So I think, it's just like the constant refrain.
Okay, thank you. Kevin?
Kevin Morgan, Cardiff University, Julie. You haven't said much about politics this evening, and you criticised throughout your work, not just this evening, some of the familiar mantras and icons of the food movement.
Yeah.
Organics, farmers markets, CSAs. You've even criticised Michael Pollan, for God's sake.
Especially Michael Pollan.
But could you tell us what are the political implications of your argument this evening for the food movement?
Well, thank you for that question. The implications are that the food movement really needs to focus much more on the policy environment than on teaching people how to eat or just making sure everybody, that fresh fruits and vegetables are available in low-income neighborhoods. I can't speak to it here, but in the U.S. there's, it's so hard. And again, I learned this from working with my students. It's so hard to find people who actually want to get into the trenches of working on policy of there's great organizations that do work on regulating pesticides, there's a few organizations that work on trying to change U.S. agricultural policy, and change our commodity subsidies. But that's not where the action is. Everybody who wants to volunteer to change the food system, and there are lots of them. It's the hugest movement of our time, and they all want to get in the garden or in the kitchen and again teach people how to grow and eat food. And so the implication is all this interest needs to be focused much more on policy.
Okay, I think we can just thank Julie for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.